Hello and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Irish Writers Centre Climate Writing session. This is number 6, the first of the autumn series. This is a free series of webinars made possible by UNESCO Dublin City of Literature, and we're delighted to have as our host Kerri Dochartaigh. For each session, Kerri is joined by 2 different guests with the goal of exploring climate action and finding solutions through fiction, poetry, and creative non-fiction. To keep up to date on all the events at the Irish Writers Centre, do sign up to our newsletter on our website. Kerri Dochartaigh is a mother, writer, and grower who currently explores ideas of emergency, interconnectedness, and ecologies of care. Her first book, Thin Places, was published by Canongate in spring 2021, for which she was awarded the Butler Literary Award in 2022, highly commended for the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing, and shortlisted for the Irish Francophonie Ambassadors Literary Award in 2024. Cacophony of Bone was published by Canongate in May 2023 and was longlisted for the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing. She mentors and teaches worldwide. She lives in the west of Ireland with her family, and now it gives me immense pleasure to hand you over to Kerri Dochartaigh, who will introduce you to her 2 guests this evening, Sarah Thomas and Diva Harris. Over to you, Kerri.
Oh, Damien, Gormaga, thanks a million. That was a really beautiful start to the evening. And it is an absolute joy for me to have both of these incredible creative beings on this call. I'm just going to quickly tell you who they both are before we do as regular as we always do, and we move into our first part of the evening, which will be myself and Sarah Thomas in conversation, and then we'll move over to Diva Harris, and then we'll have a short comfort break, and then we'll be back together to do a little bit of writing. Okay, so Sarah Thomas is a British-Icelandic interdisciplinary artist. She's a writer and a traveller. On her debut, this gorgeous book, The Raven's Nest, An Icelandic Journey Through Light and Darkness, is an ecological memoir by a transformative half decade living in Iceland's West Fjords. We'll then move in a wee while to Diva Harris. Diva is the editor of the absolutely incredible Caught by the River, which is an online meeting place for arts, nature, and culture. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. We're going to begin with you, Sarah, and just firstly, thank you so much for being here with us for our climate writing session. It's been a real joy for me to be back with your book again, The Raven's Nest. I was lucky enough to read it in an early copy, and I read it when I was pregnant. So it was quite a while ago, and I was in that kind of very thin liminal space of pregnancy. Revisiting the book was really quite transformative for me because my brain is backfiring a little bit with a little bit more cylinders, and I could just pick up all these parts. What was really interesting is first time round, so I used this system where I use sticky tape, washi tape, and so I can tell my old washi tape that I used in my new one. And it's quite nice to see the parts that I kind of didn't really pick up on first time round, or I don't know, I was in a different space. But I actually think that I want to begin with that because I think that speaks a lot to what this book is for me. So for those of you that haven't read The Raven's Nest, it's kind of billed as an ecological memoir. But what I would say is, Sarah, it's also really a book about creating. It's really a book about art and craft, and it's a book about how we inhabit a body. It's a book about how we inhabit space, how we kind of move through spaces and allow them to move through us. And so to begin with, I would love to ask you, where did you begin with this book? Like what was the story of this book?
Well, that's very perceptive of you, because the story of this book was that there was a story in my body that hadn't got made as a film. And I'd been in Iceland as a filmmaker, but previously I'd made films, documentary films and ethnographic films in context where I wasn't also trying to integrate into that context. And the act of, you know, falling in love and being part of a family made my attempts at shooting footage, excuse me, feel rather strange, because my positionality was shifting all the time, and I just didn't know, who is this person trying to tell this story, who is speaking, and who's the story about. And so I have a lot of footage. I have a lot of rushes that sit on a hard drive and have never been made into a film. And one day maybe I'll revisit them in a different way. But I knew that I'd witnessed and participated in and lived and breathed, you know, a life that had so much in it that could be of use to us going forward. And it felt so like the embodied feeling of the life there is so different to life in the UK. So different. And I wanted to unearth what that is. And I wanted to also give the reader the experience of feeling differently in their body, of like how we might live differently in a time of unraveling. So yeah, my body was kind of full of this story, and I had to put it somewhere. And I just began an evening class in creative writing, and every prompt they gave us, I was writing something to do with this.
Wow.
And after a while, quite a few of them said, I think there might be a book in you there.
Wow. It's always so lovely for a writer to hear about another writer's story, especially for a book that really impacted on them. And there's so much crossover in our work. And something that I have found very touching through both of my kind of quite hands-on readings of this book is you're just such a beautiful writer. You know who you really are. And what can often happen a lot of the time is when people try to describe a landscape or try to describe a life, it can get very bogged down with detail that's very specific to their own story. But actually, something about the way that you weave your words, I was right there with you in Iceland. I was right there with you when you were describing your upbringing. Well, not upbringing, I think you moved to Kenya at about 11, didn't you? But I was there with you, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the importance of language and, you know, your relationship with the beauty of language, particularly in relation to writing a memoir that touches on climate crisis and emergency.
Well, I think beauty is not a luxury or a distraction. It's a fundamental. Like, beauty is expression. You know, beauty is the earth expressing itself. It's us expressing ourselves. And there can be beauty in exquisite grief as well. And I feel like living in Iceland kind of it held space for a really wide bandwidth of emotional states as well. And the weather holds those emotional states, the land holds those emotional states, not in conflict necessarily, sometimes simultaneously. You know, it's like it's a place where paradoxes can exist, you know, just in your day-to-day. For example, sometimes it was brighter at night in a full moon than it had been during the day in winter, which to someone in the UK, it's like, how does that work? But it's like, it was true, and that was my lived reality. And I think beauty can be incredibly healing as well. And I don't believe in that kind of beauty that smothers over the cracks. I believe in like peering into the cracks and finding the gold in there. So I think an important part of the language actually in this was wanting to language that elemental experience. And also a strong kind of cultural tradition is a kind of oral storytelling, in the sense of like narrating your day to family members and other friends. You know, there was this mode where, you know, someone's, even if you don't understand Icelandic, you know, someone is telling a story and people kind of lean in. And so I was really conscious that I wanted that to be part of the book. So I did read it. I did consciously write it as something that would sound good read aloud and would be enjoyable to hear read aloud.
Absolutely.
And therefore would land, going back to the body, it would land in the body and not the intellect. Go straight.
Absolutely.
To the body. So,
that sounds so beautiful.
If that answers your question. Exactly,
it does, and actually I think that leads us into what I'm going to ask you next, which is, would you mind reading some of that really beautiful story to us, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
And I should say that actually, when you talk about language in Iceland, and I'm talking about human language and the more than human language, I found that silence was as important as words. So the space between words, but also in the silence between conversations, it's not silent at all. It's full of sounds and it's just
Pregnant.
us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to read you a section about that. I notice how differently I've come to feel about the silence in this short time. I realize that the radio is not on as it used to be, almost constantly. I feel less need to drown out an absence of something or distract myself, finding myself strong enough now to be curious about what is here. If I do switch on the radio, I do not reach straight for British podcasts to keep me anchored in my former identity, rather listening to the melodic burbling of Icelandic Baus 8 Radio 1, which has begun to make some sense to me now. There is little variation in tone in the presenter's voice between radio documentaries, 2 for 1 leg of lamb offers, and the obituaries, all offered at a steady pace, carrying listeners through the day, without sensationalism, ceasing just before midnight for some hours of silence. On the 23rd of December, Þorláksmessa, the anchor reads out Christmas greetings sent in from well-wishers to loved ones around the country. They read out all of them, taking the whole day over it. Soon, between the middle and the end of March, as every year, there will be an announcement that touches my heart. Lóan komin. The golden plover has come, marking the beginning of spring. Although spring is a tumultuous time of fierce winds and schizophrenic weather, it means we are on the home run to summer and the return of life. I have come to perceive the plock and crunk of the ravens, the purring wings of a flock of snow bunting, the diri of the golden plover, the drumming of the snipe, and the cooing of eider as sound markers and companions of the shifting seasons. Icelandic is a difficult and beautiful language, but I have noticed, as I utter my sentences incorrectly, that much of being understood is about my finding an appropriate pace and cadence for my words, leaving space between them for other less tangible things to be heard. There is much going on in that silence. I am understood better when I do not rush to understand or express everything immediately, as I once might have done. It feels to me that an Icelander, or a Westfjordian at least, cannot thrive any better within a crowded sentence than in a city. I have begun to change shape to see silence not as an absence of words, but as a presence of a different character. I have begun to see too that this place is not at the edge of the world, but the center. It is only remote if you are not standing here, as Bjarni's family has been and will continue to do, noticing when the snow comes later and thinner, noticing the storms becoming more frequent, noticing that the puffins are so few some years because there is little for them to eat. It is the nexus of so many relationships which hang in the balance, the flow of ocean currents, the regulation of the world's temperatures, the seasonal choreography of life, the making and unmaking of the world itself.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. It's so beautiful to hear it read in your own voice. And yeah, I really love that section. I love so many sections, but I really love that section in how you kind of your story, you know, your relationship with Iceland, why you moved there, your love with your partner, and then your love with the landscape, and with the other than human kin, is kind of interwoven with these kind of beautiful meditative reflections on things like color or light or kind of your relationship with food that has changed a lot since you moved there. And I wonder how you kind of, there's a kind of sense of an understory there, which I don't think you could write about Iceland if you're you without this understory of the knowledge of the changes that the tourism of the country has brought. And then you've got the kind of the climate emergency as well. And I wonder how you managed to kind of hold both of them and weave them in together. Was that a difficult thing to do in a memoir?
It wasn't difficult in the sense that I feel like this story was already written inside me before it kind of spilled out onto the page. And those things are always your reality. It's not something that's like a strand that you follow and then try and weave in. So if I was writing fully about my life, I mean, I worked in the tourism industry as well. And, you know, I'm living on the edge of a fjord and the weather's doing what it's doing. People are living with the reality of the Gulf Stream collapsing and how that might change everything. So, and not to mention the volcanic activity that was a constant rumbling in the text as well. So that is just the lived reality. And there's something about Iceland that means that there's no amount of tarmacking over that the rawness of the land and what it does that will distance you from it in a way that you can kind of be cocooned. Like there was no cocoon.
Yeah.
Or the cocoon is in family and, you know, but it's not a real cocoon.
Completely. And I want to come back to that idea of family and community. But before I do so, I just want to remind all the members of the audience that now would be a really good time to start popping your questions for Sarah into the Q&A. Any questions around style or kind of, or the book if you've read it, or if you're intrigued, or if you kind of just want to know anything at all, as long as it's respectful, then pop it into the chat, and I'll just keep going. Sarah, something that came up a lot more for me on this fresh reading of the book was, your emphasis on kind of exploring the idea of family and community within Iceland. So for those who haven't read it, Sarah moves, she falls in love with someone and moves there and lives with him, but also lives really close alongside his family. And so Bjarni, if I'm saying it right, Bjarni's family are kind of, they're really a big part of why you get to be there, because, you know, they're part of getting your house in the kind of housing crisis, and they provide food, and there's a real barter system there that you're really taken by. And you sort of say a few times it reminds you of Kenya in many ways. I wonder if you could talk a little bit to, I suppose, the community element, the family element, and why you felt it was important to write about that being important for the choices you were making for your life.
Yeah, well, I think it's true that, so the West Fjords is the part of Iceland, when you bear in mind that Iceland is an island in the middle of the Atlantic, which has always been kind of not cut off, because there was huge kind of, you know, when everything was navigated by sea, it's kind of in the middle of everything, but having to be incredibly resourceful and resilient. And then the West Fjords is a kind of uber resilient part of that. It survived, you know, people there survived the plagues, the volcanic eruptions. So like the West Fjordians are known to be the most resilient people in Iceland. And it was really striking to me that, you know, the extended family is your social context. You know, people mostly hang out with their families. They have friends maybe from school that they've grown up with, but they're mostly hanging out. This is up in the rural areas, not so much in the cities, but and it struck me, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because it's also incredibly, there's not much privacy, and you sometimes, I really struggled with sometimes not feeling like I was leading my life or even our life as a couple. You know, it was very much, they had strong influence on what Bjarni would do or not do. But at the same time, I mean, it was just incredible. Now that I'm trying to sort of create my own life here, it's like, it's so much harder. You know, it's like, so it was striking to me, this individualism that we normalize.
Absolutely.
And what that actually does to your nervous system.
And
how quickly I could settle and feel held. When basically I married one person, but actually I married 80 people. You've got your clan, and there's always someone who's got the thing you need, and it's always getting sent with, you know, Auntie Helga, because she's coming from that place, and you need something from that. You know, everything just sort of works in this really
totally
way.
And I found that very impactful, actually, because I think as we, you know, we talk an awful lot on these calls about how we write the polycrisis, like how what genre we choose, or kind of what we choose to put in, or how we kind of safely hold the reader and hold these ideas that can be really hard and really triggering and tricky ideas. And I think that something about the way that you explored ideas of family and community in its duality, like in its kind of myriad problems as well, was also really, it was like almost like solution based. And you talk a lot about the fact that in Iceland, what you were touched by was that they just, something comes up and they just find the solution, you know? And I find that, yeah, I find that
there
quite,
and then, and they're not waiting for
yeah,
someone else to do it. It's just like problem.
right.
And but also, I mean, it does give rise to a quite like cowboyish approach to things. Sometimes it's like solution is like, oh my God, really? But you know, it's like people feel empowered and have agency to try. For example, I mean, just to give an amazing example, so the front cover of the paperback has this
Yeah, so
incredible
beautiful.
family photograph on the front, which is a house being towed on a fjord by a boat.
Amazing.
And that was my former father-in-law. He bought this house very cheaply because, and the condition of sale was it had to be moved from the place because they were building a petrol station. And he had a piece of land that was several fjords away, but it's like,
Yeah,
it's going to be much easier to get it there on the water. So he just hacked off the concrete basement, emptied out everything unnecessary from the inside, and filled it with empty oil barrels and strapped them around the side, and then just got his
incredible.
boat to tow it. And there was
So
like the whole
good.
extended family, you know, and it was
Yeah,
an adventure
yeah,
that they did in midsummer, and they had to just put it on the beach, wait for the tide to rise to lift it off, and then pull it out.
incredible.
And I've got on my Instagram page, I've got a video that I made of like speaking to a farmer who'd witnessed this boat floating on the ocean from his island, and he'd looked out his kitchen window one day and
Incredible. Wow.
their house, like, but my father-in-law, he was particularly known for being quite like adventurous like that.
Okay.
But they
Yeah.
got it in place, and it's now their
Fantastic.
summer house, you
Yeah.
know. So it's like just try.
Totally. I would love to ask you, in what ways do you feel like that half decade in Iceland has kind of shaped or impacted on your creative practice, especially in relation to kind of how you yourself are navigating the polycrisis?
Well, I think first and foremost, it was like an apprenticeship, and it made me into a writer in the sense that I told you. It was like actually moving towards writing from filmmaking. A part of that decision was like, what could I do if, you know, if the power went out? Like, I want something that doesn't require, you know, like mining the earth for metals, that wouldn't require electricity. Like, what can I do with my body and the basic materials? And writing is incredibly minimalist in that sense. So that's one thing.
That's so powerful. I find that very powerful. Thank you. Sorry,
and
go on.
also kind of like when you have text, you can share it immediately with your voice with a room full of people. You can just read to them by candlelight. And in fact, that's how I toured the book, was reading to people by candlelight and inviting them to bring things to make and mend with their hands whilst I read to them, because a part of the narrative is about creation and repair. So I wanted that to be like in the room as well as in the text. And thirdly, I think in terms of this book, the structure, the Raven's Nest is not only, you know, the title, it's actually it's an overarching metaphor for the form of the book. And it was inspired by a provocation by Ursula Le Guin of, you know, what does, in an essay she wrote called The Carry Bag Theory of Fiction, that was countering the shape of the narrative arc that we take for granted as the shape that stories have to go, where something is overcome or killed, and then there's this resolution that happens at the end. And in my own story, there was no real resolution either. And life has things that are beginning and ending all at the same time. I don't feel like there's a beginning, middle, and end. There's endings. We've had many apocalypses. We are having many apocalypses all the time. So I wanted to write in a way that allowed for that multiplicity of beginnings and endings, and also the many threadedness, you know, decentering a human narrator to make space for all the other voices that might want to come in, and also inhabiting like the paradox I was talking about earlier. So there's certain things that I like to explore over and over again in the text, but coming at them from different angles and never arriving at some like neat version of what it is. It's like, it's all of these things.
Absolutely. It is a very specific kind of narrative, and it's one that I love. And thankfully, it's one that is actually being allowed to be published within mainstream publishing, which is, generally thought as quite a standard trope when it comes to kind of healing memoirs, which, yeah.
Yeah.
But I
But,
love
but
that
this wasn't like I wasn't healed by it.
No.
And yeah, but I think it helped. I'd already written it when I handed it to publishers. Like if I'd made a proposal, they would have tried to shape it more like that. And I actually had to
Absolutely.
push back against, like I turned down an agent who wanted it before I'd written it because I wanted to let it be itself first.
Absolutely. Lovely. One more call out to audience members. If you have any questions at all that you want to ask Sarah, please pop them in the chat. I'm going to keep going otherwise. So Sarah, one big question from me, I ask all of the people who are in conversation with me on these calls, what brings you hope right now?
I know that we all have the capacity to fall in love. I think that's a really important one. And so if you can, if you can fall in love yourself, and if you can help others fall in love with things, I'm not talking about just other humans, I'm talking about, place and situation. I'm really moved by like the capacity when you feel like you belong to the earth, the capacity to kind of keep weaving yourself into it. And I think, a lot of the problem is people's feeling of exile,
Yes.
from themselves, from the land beneath their feet. And a lot of that is also about language. It's like we need to find a language that weaves us back in. And I do think that that's a big problem with the polycrisis is the languaging of it. It's distancing and deadening.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't allow for that movement through grief towards something else. Not saying there's grief and then there's the other side of grief. It's coming up all the time. But I think allowing for that grief to be acknowledged and named is really important. Sorry, I've forgotten your question. What was the
It was
question?
what brings you hope, and I think you answered it really beautifully.
Yeah.
The way that we can fall in love, and I suppose that love for me is really what your book is about. It's not just the relationship with you and your ex-husband, but is it a book about love? Is that how you would term it?
It's about many things, but I think the love, and like you say, not just between two people, but the love for a place, being claimed by that place was incredibly, that's definitely, it's like an ode to a place that changed me. And actually, like, it's funny, this was the first bio I've been asked for that is with my new identity as being also an Icelandic citizen, which is super exciting. And so what's really lovely is I've been awarded citizenship partly because of the book. It's like a special route for people who've made cultural contributions, and that is just the most amazing, like, full circle to come into.
Very, very beautiful. And last question, because we haven't had any in the Q&A, so I've just been allowed to roll with it. I know that for some writers, this can be a tricky one. Oh, I do have one question, but I'll ask this question and then I'll ask my own. So Monica has asked, which nature writers have inspired you?
Well, I was just talking about this the other night, that like I feel like just to kind of the genre of nature writing has been invented kind of in UK, US, and I tried to write an article about my top 10 nature memoirs, which included someone that I really wanted to celebrate, and I wasn't allowed to include them because it wasn't considered, straightforward memoir. And that was Tanya Tagaq, who is an Inuk like throat singer and writer and poet and all sorts, and it's so hybrid in its form, but that hybridity it's not an intellectual exercise, it's not craft, it's like that is her worldview and that is the body she inhabits, and it's absolutely stunning. Like it blows the socks off anything else I've read in the past 10 years.
That sounds wonderful. Maybe you can pop that into later on into the chat for us, for people to kind of note it down.
Sure.
Then the other, The other question from an anonymous attendee, thanks for your reflections and reading. I'm interested in your aim of writing something that lands in the body rather than in the intellect. As someone with a background in sociological writing about climate change and polycrisis, I'm hoping to explore creative writing as a means of attempting to marry the two. Would you have any advice on this?
Yeah, remember that you are a body.
Remember that you are a body. So good. I love it.
You're not just the head sitting on a
I
laptop,
love it.
your whole body. So make sure that before you start writing, you do something to get into your body, and
Yes.
kind of throw yourself into, like, I write sometimes in water, I write like in different settings, like sitting on a beach. I love writing outside. I mean, maybe start there, just make sure you're writing outside, not inside.
That's gorgeous.
And start off by taking notes in a notebook that's a bit more portable than just being in this dynamic with like sitting at a screen.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're a minute over, but I just want to quickly ask you, what are you working on right now?
I am working on a book about the intertidal zone and the menopause, midlife, and states of flux. So yeah, I can't really say much more than that because I'm finding my own way with it, and I'm not sure. But
well, we're keen. We're waiting with like all of our anticipation. Sarah, it's been absolutely gorgeous to talk with you. Thanks a million for talking about this gorgeous book, The Raven's Nest. You can stay on if you want to listen to Diva, or and just pop yourself on mute, or you can go whatever.
Actually, Diva was somebody who published for the first time, like one of the chapters that ended up in my book. Like it was Diva, so this is an amazing full circle.
This is gorgeous. Diva Harris, welcome. It's absolutely glorious to have you on. As Sarah has said, you've kind of been a big part for her in her journey, but it's a real pleasure for me to have you because you have been a huge part in my writing about emergency and the polycrisis and life and what it means to be a being. So it's gorgeous to have you here. Diva, I would love you to firstly kind of just, in a sentence or two, just sum up, like, what is Caught by the River, firstly, before we talk about you.
So we in the office, we're a really small team of 4, but I'm the only person whose full-time job it is, and we affectionately refer to it as an arts nature culture clash. So it's kind of a space where we try not to make it prescriptive. So kind of anything goes, but it's got an interest in nature, landscapes, the outdoors. It's kind of got a gentle focus on that, I would say.
Absolutely. Yes, gorgeous. And how long have you all been going? How long have you been there? What's the story? Is it?
Do you know what? Embarrassingly, I can't even remember when it started. I think it might have been 2011. I've been there for almost 10 years, which is unbelievable.
Yes.
I
decade.
think the site started in 2011.
But I mean, well, we know roughly.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's one of the kind of mainstay ones. And I suppose that why it felt really important for me to have you on here is because constantly, when I have any kind of call, like with anybody who's interested in writing about the climate crisis or writing about what it means to be human or in relationship with other than human worlds, I will always kind of say a very small kind of handful of places that people should consider reading regularly and keeping on board with what they do and sending work off. And Caught by the River is always in my top 3. And I wonder, what do you think it is about the way the publication works that attracts so many people? I mean, you've got huge readership, you've got a hugely diverse sort of cohort of people who regularly send you work to the site. Like, what is it about? What do you think it is that makes us so in love with you all?
I think that thing I mentioned at the beginning about not being prescriptive is really important. I try not to have preconceived ideas of what I want or what I don't want. So I guess that's being open-minded to the things that people are pitching you and sending you. you know, I can't predict what's going to come in. We welcome disparate, random
Yeah.
submissions that, yeah, I think the best pieces I've ever published, ever received, ever read through the site, including Sarah's actually. Sarah's chapter that she sent to us quite a long time before the book was published. It came out of the blue. I don't think I'd ever had any conversation with her before or anything.
Yeah.
A lot of the time it's people just come across that email address and they kind of say, oh, I don't know if you'd be into this, but I wanted to send it anyway.
Yeah.
And it was that chapter that we published was extremely visceral. It was about mostly about skinning sheep, learning to skin sheep.
Mm.
And I just, you know, I could never have predicted that I would want to publish you know, I could never have, oh, who can I commission to write a piece about how you skin an animal? But there was something extremely, it's quite hard to explain, but I think when you don't have a remit as such, or you try not to have, you know, preconceived ideas, you get these really gutsy pieces that people couldn't not write. And I think you get this kind of like pure writing that you couldn't have commissioned from people.
Completely.
It's, you know, it's real. It's just poured out of them. And sorry, I've gone off on a tangent.
No, it's perfect. It's exactly what, well, that makes sense to me perfectly. And so I suppose it kind of comes down to, you said like your core team, and I think it really sounds like it comes down to the fact that you have an openness there. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to where that openness comes from, because I mean you're living in London, which you know, you're part of a really cool hipster scene, I imagine. And what can often happen in those situations, especially in regard to publishing, is that we can get these very kind of one-sided longings or desires for work, and we can just kind of see the same thing regurgitated from the same kind of person again and again. Like, what do you think it is? Is it where does that openness come from? What did you know, what are you into? What are you into reading? What are you into listening to? I can see you're wearing a Mary Lattimore t-shirt. Who, if anyone doesn't know who Mary Lattimore is, she's an amazing American harpist. Yeah, what is it? Where does that kind of openness, that drive for the new or for the edgy come from in you? Is it coming from what you're into, or?
I think that kind of philosophy predated me working for the site. So just to I'm not going to give like a whole history, but it was set up by my colleague Jeff, who his main job is to run Heavenly, the record label. And during a time of kind of turmoil at the label where they weren't signing, or, you know, there was just like some business issue that they had to attend to. Jeff and Andrew, my colleagues, were going fishing a lot. And the site was kind of born out of the conversations you have while you're fishing. So it's not about fishing per se, but, you know, chatting about what books you've been reading. And I gather, because, you know, you are doing quite a lot of waiting around when you're fishing. So naturally they would start talking about records that they love, or you know, new, you know, I just read this great book or whatever. So I think that as a starting point means by its very nature, it's kind of open to spontaneous ideas from other people. And because it still runs out of a record label office, there is that you know, the environment that it's kind of edited in and stuff. There's always music playing. There's always people having those conversations across the desk, even if it's not specifically about what I'm doing. It kind of by osmosis almost.
Totally. Yeah, it's like that thing where when people sing to their plants or play them particular kinds of classical music, they thrive. And I suppose that what I would love to ask you is that yes, you do accept lots of different things, and that's really beautiful, but there definitely is a sense on the site of a very kind of a viewpoint that really kind of errs on the side of really loving our
Mhm.
planetary home. It's really, really ecologically minded. It is a very, I'm always kind of blown away by the kinds of things I'm thinking of, for instance, Christine McNish's regular slots where she talks about her new home in Devon, and your own slots where you talk about your dog walks, and it begins with ground cover, wall cover. So you place us in the seasons. I'm thinking about the like of Alice Fowler's, where she writes about gardening with a very kind of different viewpoint than what we might sort of perceive in a what we read as a standard kind of very kind of conservative gardening vibe. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to why that feels important for you all as a publication.
Sorry, what specifically feels important? Like having a
Just
left field.
Well, just the kinds of conversations that are published regularly, like about
Yeah,
landscape,
yeah.
about gardening in a more kind of ecologically minded way.
Hmm. Partially I think it's because look, it's a tiny publication. We don't have any money. And that at times is really hard. But the flip side of that, and the great thing about it, is we're not beholden to anyone or anything, and we don't have to tell a particular story. So I
Yeah.
welcome kind of I don't know, we can publish things that are a bit more controversial
Yeah.
or are kind of radical, or yeah, I guess think outside of mainstream narratives. And again, that is something you have to be careful with in some respects. But generally speaking, I think it gives people a lot of freedom to I don't know, I think that openness, I try and extend it into like the copy editing and stuff as well. So I try
Yeah.
not to impose too many kind of outside structures, opinions
Absolutely.
on writers. So I think part of the purpose of the publication and the space is that people can explore these ideas in ways that they can't explore them in other places, if that makes sense.
Absolutely makes total sense.
And actually, I said about not being prescriptive, but the only thing that absolutely does my head in, which you alluded to, is people trying to emulate other people's successful kind of ways of, rather than something being born of like a real interaction. I do sometimes get pieces that are like almost identical to other things, but without the sort of experiences to back them up. I think I don't mean to speak negatively about people being inspired, or like I don't always think it's conscious, but it's not like where that really primal gutsy writing is.
Totally. I understand that.
Yeah.
I would love to invite our audience members now. If you have any questions in relation to kind of Diva's role at Caught by the River, please do pop them in the Q&A, because we're approaching time that I'll be handing over to the audience. Okay, so Diva, I would love to know, we have loads of kind of budding writers, especially writers who are kind of trying to explore these ideas of kind of what it means to share an earth and to kind of to do it well. What you've said, you're not trying to have a kind of prescriptive desire for work, but what are you looking for? What do you want to get from a piece of work, or from an interview that someone might send you, or a review of a book? Like what makes you tick in relation to work you might receive?
Might have to mull that one over a little bit. I mean, yeah, the like I mentioned before, the feeling that the person didn't have an option but to write the piece, you know, it was like sort of bubbling up inside them and it needed to come out. I think you can kind of tell that, or you can kind of feel that, I think, when you read a piece. And I would much rather get a piece from a writer that is like on a slightly strange topic, but they absolutely had to write about it, than dictate to them, I would like you to write about
seaweed.
And if that, you know, if that person doesn't have a sort of intense, interesting connection to seaweed, then they might write a perfectly good piece, but it's not going to be sort of deeply compelling, probably, I think.
Absolutely.
I think write about what you deeply love or are excited about or are intrigued by. You know, I think you have to feel fired up by whatever the subject is. And that's not to say the process can't be difficult, but yeah, I think writing about something you're not truly interested in is sort of a what's the phrase, fool's errand?
Yes, absolutely. That's a really great answer. And you're open. I saw that you're kind of open for, I think you're open for submissions at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of generally are. Yes.
But now would be quite a good time.
Yes, now is quite a good time. Yeah. It's just the only thing I ask people to bear in mind is it's usually just me reading them. So quite a long
me and my team of me and my dog. I suppose what I'd love to know is, what are you reading at the moment? What are you listening to? What art are you looking at? You know, what's kind of getting you through at the moment?
Well, again, the answer to this is probably quite wide open. I love just popping down to my local library and picking up a random book that I've never heard of, or and you know, they're not always nature books. You know, it's not like I think possibly this also goes some way to answering a previous question, which is that I think a lot of the best pieces are clearly informed by more than going outside and looking at a tree and describing it, you know. I think all reading, even reading stuff you don't like that you abandon, informs your writing. And I think listening to all music informs your writing. And I think generally consuming other people's kind of creative endeavors, interacting with them, is really important. Yeah, you said Mary Lattimore. I went to a Mary Lattimore gig last week, which was really incredible. But again, you know, weirdly, I didn't go thinking this is directly related to landscape or nature, my job. But she actually has quite a lot of songs that are about, you know, she's got one about finding a beach whale, and she was speaking quite sort of touchingly about that. And that wasn't some, you know, quite often seemingly disparate or unrelated things that you're interested in can definitely actually end up being quite connected to.
Completely. And I think that's why it's really brilliant the way you do kind of encourage that on the site. Like within certain parts of the publishing world, there can be these real sort of boxing off of things. This is about this, or this is a nature book, and this is a memoir, and this is another. But actually, those boundaries they're more fluid, I think. Than
definitely.
Is there a book? Are there a few books, no matter what genre they are, that you've read recently, or a poem that you've read recently, or something that is just kind of right there at the top of your head, lingering as?
I'm just I've been quite sort of like voraciously tearing through books at the moment. So I read a quite recent Ursula Le Guin essay collection called Space Crone that Silver Press put out maybe last year.
Yeah.
I read that recently,
Yeah.
and she was just an incredible. So that this is more sort of philosophical, sociological essays rather than like her fancy writing.
Yeah.
And I think she basically put arguments into really clear terms about gender, mostly about gender, actually, that collection. I think it's a collected book of her writings on gender. But I don't know, thought and wrote in a really clever, clear way about things that people are now being very like melodramatic about. And I think I don't know, I think sometimes it's also important to think about things like society, and of course gender is not irrelevant to what we're talking about. Like I think it was Sarah, not you, saying before about whose stories get published and, you know, whose perspectives we get to hear. But also, if you're talking about someone like Ursula Le Guin, she writes about, you know, she's obviously very left wing. She writes a lot about the structures of capitalism, stuff like that, and that is inherently linked to nature, the outdoors, the climate crisis. And I think understanding those kind of structures is, you know, I'm not always mainlining philosophical texts or you know, texts about capitalism, but I do think it's important to kind of understand that I know it's a cliche, but everything is connected
Completely.
and so much of what we're seeing with the planet and the climate crisis is like so connected to kind of structures of power. And
Absolutely. I totally agree. Last call for people. If anyone has any questions for Diva about her role as editor at Copy the River, or just generally in relation to her views on things, please pop them in the Q&A. You're absolutely gorgeous, dog. Just went past there, and I think that leads me in quite nicely too. I want to talk a little bit about your gorgeous column on Caught by the River, and just could you maybe like kind of tell people what it is, where it was born from? Because I think it's a really special column, and I think it's doing really interesting. I think it's doing really interesting things, especially in relation to climate writing. So I wonder if you could kind of touch on that a little bit before we have to go.
Okay, it's called Dog Walk Report, and I started it in May, kind of not knowing where it was going to go or what it was going to be or anything like that. But I spend a lot of time walking my dog. And I think I had kind of noticed that it has kind of strengthened my ability to identify plants. It has, I don't know, I guess taught me to, I think if you're walking in the same space most days, you notice changes on a much smaller scale. Like you notice small changes in the seasons, changes in plants, changes in park management. I love to bang on about how the park's being managed, but I'm still, it's because I'm the editor of the site, I find it quite difficult to write a column and know if it's any good, because
I understand
I
that.
don't have an editor to go to. So
I get it. Well, I can tell you it's very good. I
Oh,
mean,
thank
I
you.
love it. I love it. My second book, Cacophony of Bone, when I describe it, I basically have recently started to describe it as it's just a book about walking my dog in the same two fields for a year. You know, so I'm obsessed with your column. But what I would say is that there's something about any writing that kind of hones in on these details that you've just spoken about. And I do believe that you're right, that your dog, someone's just said in the comments, it's like their dog, really beautiful. But you're, you know, being along with an other than human being when we're in the natural world kind of does something to the way that we interact. Would you agree?
Definitely. Also because their sense of I was going to say smell and sound, but also I have a lurcher who's a sight hound, so she can see things and notice things moving very far away that probably if I didn't have her I wouldn't pay attention to.
Yeah.
So I guess it's kind of walking with her has required me to kind of retrain my senses in some respects to mostly make sure she doesn't get into trouble. But at the same time, I've kind of, like noticed things along.
Totally. Yeah, completely. I've got one question from an anonymous attendee, and then we'll move on to my final question, unless anyone else wants to pop one in. Anonymous attendee, death of the poor and climate change is raw, but needful to talk and write about. What do you think? I think that's really death of the person. I think it's really a question around like what we're living through, these crises that we're living through. They are really raw, but it's really necessary to talk and write about. What do you think?
I mean, definitely. Yeah, without a doubt. What I would say is that something I've been trying to kind of think about is that more than one thing can be true at once. And so I think it's really important to recognize significant, awful things that are happening, but that doesn't have to be the only focus of something that you're writing.
Absolutely.
It's really, really important to recognize,
to hold it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not to kind of shy away from difficult things. I mean, also, I think if you try and write about the outdoors without and deliberately ignore sort of fundamental truths about where we are and awful things that are happening, that writing in a sense will feel sort of inadequate, I think, maybe inauthentic. You can't, you can't turn your back on those things, but at the same time I think it's okay to recognize
absolutely
other elements. It doesn't have to be the sole focus of your writing.
Absolutely. That's really well put. Thank you, Diva. The final question from our audience, Annie Older, referring back to compelling stories, are there any interesting takes on belonging in nature that you have recently come across as an editor or in other ways? So interesting takes on belonging in nature.
Yes. So there's a really great writer called Michael Millay who we were introduced to. We did some events with the Willow Herb Review, which was a publication set up to make space specifically for writers of colour in a nature writing space. But he's actually just won the Wainwright Prize, I think.
Yeah, he did.
He wrote, I mean, this is like slightly on a tangent from the question, but he wrote an incredible piece a few years ago, which was one of those that just dropped into my lap and I was like, oh my God. That kind of combined sitting on a riverbank in Bristol and also the migrant crisis in this really unbelievable sleight of hand way where I couldn't even work out how he'd done it. But yeah, I would recommend his work in general, and I think the Willow Herb Review site is still up, so you can go back and there's a lot of writing about.
Gorgeous recommendation, really beautiful, Diva. Thank you. I would like to ask you my final question, which I ask everybody, which is, what brings you hope, Diva?
I sort of panicked when you asked this question, but luckily it meant I had some time to think about it. I think it's difficult. I'm sure a lot of people find it difficult, and yeah, I think sometimes it's really hard to have hope. But I think creativity and also resistance give me hope. People, particularly creative resistance, if that makes sense, but people resisting things even though it's difficult and uncomfortable gives me hope. And that, that manifests in a lot of ways. That can be through writing, but it also can be through physical protest. It can be through, all kinds of things. But yeah.
Gorgeous, Diva. Thank you so, so very much. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, a real joy. And I would thoroughly recommend that everybody checks out Cope by the River and Diva's column. And also, Diva, do you want to give a wee shout out to your other amazing thing that you do?
Oh, which one? What do you mean?
You're DJing. Do you want to do
yeah,
a
so
call
I
out?
do have a radio show, which is not, I was gonna say it's not related to my job, but I think everything
it
is
is.
related.
Yeah.
Like, we do play all kinds of music, but yeah, I have a monthly Soho radio show with my
Soho
friend.
radio show.
Yeah, called Token Girl DJs.
Yeah, definitely check it out. It gets me through any kind of hard-working day.
That's so
Thank
kind.
you so much for coming on and talking to us, Steve. It's been an absolute joy.